Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to our Fellows Public Talk series. I'm Claudia Rizzini, the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program here at the Radcliffe Institute. It is my pleasure to introduce Gabeba Baderoon. On a sweltering afternoon in Johannesburg in 1948, the air crackled with tension as the election result announced the National Party's victory, ushering in an era that would cast a dark shadow across South Africa and shape the contours of Gabeba's childhood. Raised under apartheid and amidst the volatile years leading up to Nelson Mandela's election in 1994, Gabeba and her work reflect the visceral experience of living as an exile, both within and outside one's country of origin, the threat of political persecution and forcible removal from one's home, and how these reverberate in memory, art, and the relations among people. Across her poetry collections, Gabeba draws deeply from the texture of personal and collective histories, offering readers an intimate exploration of post-apartheid South Africa and the contours of ordinary life amidst great social upheaval. As an academic, Gabeba lends her voice to critical conversations about the complex experiences of apartheid South Africa, drawing from her first-hand lived experiences of its brutality. She sheds light on the contributions of people of Middle Eastern descent who have shaped South African life. Gabeba's current project begins with an accident, a concussion caused by an accidental blow to her head on an airplane. During her year at Radcliffe, she is completing her manuscript, Autobiography of Sand, Relief Map of the Flats, a verse memoir about concussion that merges poetry and memoir to explore the slippages in memory and the non-linear nature of healing from such an injury. Gabeba situates her exploration of how human bodies fracture and heal within the landscape of the Cape Flats of South Africa, mapping relationships between cultural and personal memory and colonial and post-colonial struggles in South Africa onto her lived experience with injury and illness. The Q&A portion of the public talk today will be moderated by Aruni Keshap, Associate Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Georgia. It is my pleasure to welcome Gabeba Baderoon.
Thank you so much, everybody. I can't tell you how warmed I am by seeing you, so many of you who have come from far away in the virtual world and in this room. And I thank you from my heart, from my bones, because my poetry has come from communities that have nourished me in this way. So thank you for your presence. My gratitude is indeed to the ones who held me when I quavered, to the ones who are my muses, sometimes reluctantly, to the ones who have published me. Small publishers of poetry are angels, so let's all support them. In my case, Kwela and Northwestern, and also this magnificent entity I am part of, the African Poetry Book Fund, which has published almost 200 collections of poetry by African authors since 2012. So, and they create beautiful books. And it is this idea of the power of the aesthetic that goes through my work entirely. I thank the lovers of poetry, among them you, including Daphne Renan and the Poetry Pod here at Radcliffe. It's a very simple formula, and I recommend it to everybody. Just a gathering of people who get together maybe every week or every month and talk about a poem. And the wondrous connections and insights that emerge just will live with you. And so thank you, Daphne. Thank you to my friend Russell Frank, who has run such a thing for almost 2 decades. And one of the members is here, Vincent Colapietro, a philosopher friend of mine. I Also thank Sandra Smith, who created a writing group in which I was writing some of the material I'll be reading today, so it's partly your fault, Sandra. And also other beloved writing communities like La Belle Vie Academy. I can't go forward with this reading without thanking my truly brilliant and insightful research partners, one of whom is here, Nina Ejimanta, along with Amal Sayed and Elise Garand Hermes, as well as the poet Jolan Phillips, who I believe, along with me, is the only person who writes poetry on sand in our very sandy mutual country, South Africa. What to say but my luminous fellows at Radcliffe? You're right in here. And to Claudia, Jean, Jimena, Alison, Meg, Jane, Maria, Sharon, Kayla, and all the staff at Radcliffe, like Max, you've made this a writing paradise. My broader friends, some of you who have come, Kai, Ola, Panashi, thank you. And to arrive at the new work I will be sharing with you on the opaque, unmooring experience of concussion, I'll take you first through a path through my earlier work, because that surely is the best way to introduce me. Poetry for beginners. In the evening poetry class for beginners, a girl in a thick brown coat she doesn't take off, breathes in deep, and risking something says fast, "My boyfriend's in prison. I'm here to find out how to write to him through the bars." And someone laughs, and she pulls herself back into her coat, and from inside looks past us, and the next week doesn't come back. And I think of her for years and what poetry is. I think this is my origin, where poetry is risk, is betrayal, and the memory of the first question, how not to be alone. I'm a poet, so apparently I have to write about love. So here's an obligatory love poem. Old photographs. On my desk is a photograph of you, taken by the woman who loved you then. In some photos, her shadow falls in the foreground. In this one, her body is not that far from yours. Did you hold your head that way because she loved it? She is not invisible, not my enemy, nor even the past. I think I love the things she loved. Of all your old photographs, I wanted this one for its becoming. I think you were starting to turn your head a little, your eyes looking slightly to the side. Was this the beginning of leaving? I also have obligatory poems about photographs and films, as you could see from that one. And indeed, so thank you to all the photographers and filmmakers in the room, because you really enter my work in the deepest way. But I also learn from your failures. So this is a poem about that. Learning to love failure. Two swallows tumble like crumpled paper after each other. The camera fails again and again to find the place where life will fly through its aperture. In the meanwhile, the swallows fall like two crescent moons from the sky. Fleeting tails in a corner of emptiness, just leaving the frame. The photographer filming swallows has to learn to love failure, how the almost having of the thing is true in itself. I mentioned my reluctant muses, among them primarily my mother. My mother is exactly 30 years older than me, and she attended the University of Cape Town exactly 30 years before me. She was a medical doctor at that time. She studied for it, but her best friends were in the literature department. And throughout my childhood, she would simply recite poetry around the house. So I think in a way I lived out her dream. I thought I was going to live out her dream by becoming a doctor like her. But as she said, I ended up becoming not a real doctor, merely a PhD. So I think I lived out her dream after all, in poetry. This is an account she told me as I was growing up. And because I grew up under apartheid, I had no idea that it was an extraordinary story. Once I finally did realize that, this is what I wrote. I forget to look. The photograph of my mother at her desk in the 50s has been in my purse for 20 years. Its paper faded, browning, the scalloped edge bent, then straightened. In it, the collar of her dress folds discreetly. The angle of her neck looks as though someone has called her from far away. She was the first in her family to take the bus from Claremont up the hill to the university. But at one point during the lectures at medical school, Black students had to pack their notes, get up, and walk past the ascending rows of desks out of the theater. Behind the closed door, in an autopsy Black students were not meant to see, the uncovering and cutting of white skin. Under the knife, the skin, the mystery of sameness. In a world that defined how Black and white could look at each other, touch each other, my mother looks back, her poise unmarred. Every time I open my purse, she is there, so familiar, I forget to look at her. So indeed, I write, according to her, a little too much about my mother. But I continue to learn lessons from her, of course, as I do about my father, who is my other great muse. I came to the US in 1999 on a brief one-semester fellowship at Penn State University. At the time, I was a graduate student working too much of theory and literature. So during the semester, I decided I would expand my life. So I took yoga classes, drawing classes, and tucked in somewhere was a poetry writing class. And that is how poetry started for me, as a hobby, as a side to my real job. And in that protected side area, I think I could do more interesting work eventually. My father died 1 month before I came to the US during that time, and so almost immediately he became an enormous part of my writing. Give. Before dawn, low voices briefly loud, my father and his friend, the ambulance driver, his days off, always in the middle of the week, drive away from the house with thick sandwiches and a flask of tea, and my father's green and white fishing rod whipping the wind behind the '76 Corolla. Camping by the sea, we'd see him take his rod further down the beach, walk waist deep into the water, plant himself with legs apart in the breakers, reach back, cast the line baited with choker, and pull, giving, then tightening the line, nudging its weighted stream of gut to the fish. But in this place on the west coast they never disclosed, they stand unwatched, out of reach of each other's lines, and at their backs a fire on the beach, not stemming the dark, but deepening it. Often it would come to nothing, their planting and pulling. But sometimes the leather cups holding the ends of their fishing rods strained as they bent back against the high howl of the reels being run to the limit and holding, bowing forward and giving and leaning back and pulling. Their bodies make a slow dance nobody sees. And at home, the scraping of scales from halyun and yellowtail and slitting the silver slick of skin to make thick steaks for supper, setting aside the cater for breakfast, the head for soup, and the gills and fat for the cats, while they tell us how they landed them. I wonder about the empty days, more frequent, the solitary standing in the dark at the edge of something vast, sea and sky, throwing a thin line into the give of it, and waiting, silent and waiting until something pulls against your weight. Mothers and children, fathers and children. It's obligatory, isn't it, to write about that? War triptych. Silence, glory, love. 1. Accounting. The mother asked to stay. She looked at her silent child. I was waiting for you. The quiet of the girl's face was a different quiet. Her hands lay untouched by death. The washer of bodies cut away her long black dress. Blue prayer beads fell to the floor in a slow accounting. The washer of bodies began to sing a prayer to mothers and daughters. The mother said, "Who will wait for me?" 2. Father receives news his son died in Gaza. When he heard the news, Mr. Karim became silent. He did not look at the cameras, nor at the people who brought their grief. He felt a hand slip from his hand, a small unclasping, and for that he refused the solace of glory. 3. Always for the first time. We tell our stories of war like stories of love, innocent as eggs. But we will meet memory again at the wall around our cities, always for the first time. It took me 12 years to finish this particular book, my third one. And in the course of writing it, I realized that I revisited some of the stories that I'd written about before. So I think of them now as sort of serial poems, and maybe that is the beginning of wanting to write more expanded forms like memoir. This is the title poem, The History of Intimacy. The history of intimacy. 1. You remember it because it's a wound. A cut, 20 cuts, the name for the canings on the palm, on the knuckles, on the buttocks. A finely graded order of pain that we, who should not exist, were assigned for our failures. 2. You keep your whitener, Mike shouts in 1987 across the heads of the students on Jamison steps, and the sudden, pale silence shows we are no longer in uniform in the quad at Livingston High, teasing, "Hey, why did you look through me as though I don't exist?" But saying it out loud reveals how we've learned to measure our existence. In the video store, after I've ordered a film, my cousin elbows me. "Why are you putting on?" Putting on, transitive verb. Putting on what? Putting on skin. Putting on not nothingness. 4. When the Group Areas Act is abolished, My mother aches to go back to the street she was removed from, and it is we, grown attached to the scar we call home, who say, no, we don't want to live in a white area. This time, ceding it ourselves. 5. Mother, how do I write about you? As a medical student on duty at night, she learned to sleep so lightly she could wake in an instant in an emergency. And for the rest of her life, her body became a body that never again could sleep through the night. She told of one evening when, for some reason a little irked with my father, she left the table early, returning to the bedroom by herself, and found my sister blue for lack of breath. To this day, she recalls what anger gave her, how it saved my sister's life. Anger, breath. Since the beginning, you have been breath and poetry. You told me how black students were asked to leave the room during the autopsy of white bodies. And of my writing about this, you said, that is my story. That is not your story. And now, with the illness you could not speak of for years, Mother, am I again turning your words and your silence into a poem? 6. In 1988 at Crawford train station, my brother and I find a blue plank hand-painted in yellow letters, non-whites only on one side, whites only on the other, thrown away by the fence next to the tracks. Picking it up, we see the two sides of the sign lie back to back, each half resting against its opposite, intimate and inverse and unknown to each other. We knew this was history someone had made by hand, then hidden and tried to forget. We bring it home and come across it sometimes in a corner when we're looking for something else. That was the path through my earlier work. And now I'm going to do something that I very rarely do, which is intrude on the territory of the filmmakers and the photographers and show you an image. That image was taken in the backyard of my mother's house where I grew up for 28 years. And if, like me, what you see is a smoky golden texture, you might be interested to know that that is a scuffed, faded, unpainted wall. And that exquisite bird or set of birds is one common sparrow. And it was taken by a film camera, which of course remembers, and that's why it looks like there are multiple birds with the echoes of its previous self and its shadows. You can only take film like that if you've lived there for a long time and you've seen how shadows change over the years and over the hours. And when you're still enough for the birds to trust that they can come back. That particular backyard is maybe the centrifugal focus of this new book that I am writing. It is in a landscape called the Cape Flats, and it, strangely enough, allowed me to understand the experience of concussion, which was a condition that totally unmoored me and then remade me. So it's strange to think that what I'm calling the Cape Flats, which literally is 500 square kilometers or 200 square miles of a more or less even landscape just behind Table Mountain. So if you know Cape Town and you've visited it, you probably have never looked at the Cape Flats because it's not a place that you can see if you've grown up looking at Cape Town from the mountain. Because the Cape Flats is the hinterland, it is behind the mountain. And part of the way that we've grown up looking at Cape Town produces the invisibility of the Cape Flats. There's somebody in the audience today named Nolene Murray, who's a very dear friend of mine, who, when we were both graduate students, shared with me an archive of landscape paintings that were painted on Signal Hill, just above the city of Cape Town. And those paintings established the official view. This is how to see Cape Town. The painters who painted those paintings were standing on the largest slave graveyard of the city. So the city was produced through the invisibility of the people who built it and were enslaved by it. So that is the city and how I eventually came to write about it, thanks to Nolene. But now I'm writing about a place that cannot be seen by that city. And I'm looking in the audience at a friend of mine, Maura O'Gara, who actually is an American who came to study at the University of Cape Town with me. And thanks to her, I actually saw my city from a different perspective. Because I never knew Cape Town was a beautiful place until I saw it through the eyes that came from somebody who loved it differently. So, because the major feature of the Cape Flats in this image is its sand. And if you read colonial era diaries, you'll read complaints about this relentless sand and the lashing wind and the sand and the sand and the infinite sand. So this is still a feature and a complaint of the place today. But actually, when I started looking into this phenomenon, I discovered that the entire peninsula, not only the flats, but the entire larger region that is the Cape, is constituted of 30 meters of sand, like that's 90 feet of sand, which has been blown by the sea across millennia. So when we're complaining about sand, we're actually complaining about the very foundation of the thing we're standing in. So of course, that tipping over into not only now, not only apartheid, not only even slavery, but deep time means that being on that landscape suddenly is a geological experience, right? So it really offers itself to me as a material in new ways. This overlooked place, and this place that I want to think from and think through. So with that somewhat long introduction, let me read a little bit of this new work that I'm blaming Sandra for. My inheritance as a child of apartheid and forced removals is an intense attachment to place, because, of course, under those systems, place receded from me. So I try to anchor it, moor it, fix it. For me, body is a place, imagination is a place, language is a place. And being attached intensely to it means that immediately on arrival, I grow roots, even short-term roots, even when I'm there for a week. But concussion meant plummeting into a new country, waking up in an unfamiliar house inside my own skin. I have no gift for movement. I have lived in one house for 28 years and in another for 21. But with no practice of easy relocation, one day I abruptly found myself in a new terrain called concussion. I, who am constantly shoring up my foundations, my boundaries, my edges, found myself distributed beyond my body, not sure where I ended. Thinning beyond myself, diluted, leaking, but also trapped in my mind, in a room that was unfamiliar and shatteringly empty and lonely. I found my body not known to me, a neighborhood with new coordinates. From this place called concussion that I didn't recognize, whose boundaries did not contain me, with a body whose bearing and posture were new to me, I needed a language for that thing that unmoored me, which took away my hold over time. For instance, my certainty that the walk around my house took 5 minutes rather than 20. These basic contracts, these basic arrangements with the rational world were no longer in operation. And also suspended was the agreement that words would follow thought, that tongue would issue sound, that I could answer the world. When the phone rang, I stared at it and could not coordinate the intricate mechanism to approach it. I had the parts of speech, but no subject at the head of the sentence. I had the building blocks of a concept, but no architecture. The mechanism that arranged things, that called its parts into order, was absent. On the phone, I saw that the number was my mother's, and I could not cohere the distributed entity that now had the name patient, concussed into a greeting, a conversation. Inside the unfamiliar territory I now resided in was only absence and hollowness. Outside, no gravity, no boundary. Where was I? Then, place, always my grounding, gave me a language. The place I had left, the Cape Flats. Returning there, I immediately recognized the terrain. It was a place made of the thing I was, a geology, a terrain I could lay my passed-out self on, a mirror, a million pieces I could enter and stay for a while, not as metaphor, but as arrival, as sand, anchor, home. And I want to say as well, there are a couple of notes I should perhaps have read to you earlier on. Removal. When I said that my mother was removed and she ached to go back to the place she was from under the Group Areas Act, that was an act of 1950 that the apartheid government passed in order to make it illegal for people of what they call different races to live in the same place. And because races are a fictional invention, sometimes the line of race ran through families who were no longer allowed to live in the same place. And even if you were designated a different race from your neighbor, your friend, with whom you had shared a garden, with whom you had built a relationship, that too was sundered. So this idea of the loss of a sense of self, of place, of belonging has had generations-long effects, as you can imagine. So this word removed sounds almost surgical and clinical, doesn't it? But it refers to forced removals, the removal, the banishment, the exile of people from what had been their neighborhoods. And so that is what my mother ached to go back for. I was born a child of removal. I never knew what it was like to live in those places, but every home I lived in was the ghost of the place that they had lost. I never lived in her real home, ever, in those 3 decades. An ID book. This is the equivalent of an internal passport, something that is very ordinary in South Africa. You need it to open a bank account or apply for a job. But before 1994, that ID book contained your race. And so that meant it determined every possibility of your life, from where you were born, to where you were raised, where you went to school, and where you were buried. Later on, I'm going to read a quotation from the Population Registration Act of 1950. And I want to tell you, I am quoting the actual legal wording of that act, the way it was published in the Houses of Parliament, which is the actual act that records the laws in that country. I say this because when you listen to it, you're going to think it's a fantastical invention which is pungent with a sort of malevolent anxiety, with all of its repetitions and hedges and footnotes. But it is actually the law. So let me read exactly that poem, actually. It allows me to do some voices, and as you can tell, I really like doing voices. Double negation. No. Several versions of nay, nia, naiman, ha'a, related to not, none. The double negative of Afrikaans, ni, kleurling nie, not colored. The negative that haunts me, a nie blanca, non-white. Population Registration Act 30 of 1950. 3. Colored person means a person who is not a white person or a native. 10. Native means a person who in fact is or is generally accepted as a member of any Aboriginal race or tribe of Africa. 15. White person means a person who in appearance obviously is or is generally accepted as a white person, but does not include a person who, although in appearance obviously a white person, is generally accepted as a colored person. Means is or is who obviously is, or who is generally as obviously accepted, or who is or who in fact is, or who is in or is generally in fact as, or who is accepted or is not or who obviously in appearance obviously is, or is generally who is accepted as, or who, although in appearance is accepted generally as, who is generally, or who is obviously but does not include who is accepted, who in appearance, who appears obvious, who is obvious, who appears to be, who appears, who is, general, is accepted as is. The double negative of coloredness, neither a white person nor a native. One line, the law of colored, neither or. Native, in fact, and accepted, 2 clauses of purity for the law of native. The law of white, 3 lines of law, clause of appearance and performance, of acceptance and hedge of deception, and footnote of evasion, and or is not accepted, not. Looking at apartheid, I am insistently not colored. Looking at the longer history of the Cape, when colored was the name for emancipated slave, I am not colored. Double negation. When a statement is true, it is also not true. Colored, tightly bound to farcical, drunk, lacking in culture. During Afrikaans lessons at high school, we have to say out loud, feel in our mouths, the following simile in our grammar textbook. So dronk soos 'n kleerling onderwyser, as drunk as a colored teacher. Such official and popular contempt is the direct legacy of slavery. Not enough of us write of being of slave descent in South Africa, of having a mixed body that always requires a footnote. Apartheid freighted the word native with pain and made it into a label of contempt for black people, even as white Afrikaners proclaimed a primal belonging to Africa in their name. In 2009, I gave a talk on my book regarding Muslims, and the next day's headline in the student newspaper read, South African native talks about Islam. Finally, native, somewhere. Not a wound, not a wound. I think I'm closing with the next one. It's called Adjacency, or Words for Pain. From the age of 9, I started to be not where I was from, where people shout in the streets and where the accent is flat, plat as the place. The more educated I became, the more I sounded like I came from nowhere. I left without leaving. Only years later, I recognized the kinetic velocity of shame, of wanting to disappear from where I was. Now I've come back. For 3 years after my concussion, I kept a pain diary on the instruction of my doctors. Every day, I dutifully logged the present continuous tense of pain. Pounding, piercing, grinding, throbbing. On a flight from Cape Town to Frankfurt in 2018, in the dark, in the middle of the night, or night when you're flying through time zones and 89 latitudes, night without a stable orientation to the sun, the invented night that falls when the lights on a plane are dimmed, night in a darkened capsule within the dark. An object fell from the overhead luggage compartment onto my head, the sharp edge of it, the metal corner. Later, I think that my head, my mind, continued a kind of flight of thoughts, flight of ideas, flight of self. I remember that night acutely, but forgot other things. Concussive, jarring, a soft internal machine becomes softly blank, not. And into the vast space of not enters pain, daily pain, complex, compelling pain. To record it as my doctors instruct, I reach for vocabulary for pain and find nothing equal to the singularity of it. Just standard depleted terms, dull, aching, spike, bruise. I take recourse in simile, scalp as sensitive as, then not words, whoosh, ah. Beneath this narrow lexicon are the creative journals I could not write for 3 years, fragments of the non-existence of things beneath the logs of pain. From years of keeping the pain diaries, I learned that to attend to pain in order to record it means to be fully present to it, intently living it, and this deepens it, like poetry. Then a turn. Try not to think about it, advises my brother-in-law, an ENT surgeon. What does it mean not to think about the present tense of pain? I try adjacency, nearness, stepping to the side of my body, myself, circling it and not touching it. Living next to pain means living shallowly, flitting, not feeling anything. 3 years after my injury, I returned to the flats. 100,000 years ago, it was a seabed, and for the past century, it's been a place for throwaway people. In the colonial period, settlers' ox wagons devastated its delicate desert ecology and turned it into what they called it already, a wasteland. During apartheid, the flats was where the government threw black people they'd forcibly removed from the neighborhoods, nearly declared white. The usual register for speaking about the flats is contempt or pathos. But living there again, I find that not leaving teaches me a language for the not me of concussion. Also, a different vocabulary for the flats. This matters because despising the flats helps to erase the memory of slavery in South Africa, a forgotten brutality that lasted from 1658 to 1834. Sexual violence was so widespread during that time that the Cape Colony had one of the most racially heterogeneous populations on Earth. After emancipation in 1834, and today, it is 3 days and 190 years since emancipation at the Cape. After emancipation in 1834, enslaved people whose origins lay in East Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, and who were the majority of the population of the Cape Colony, were named coloureds. A century later, apartheid used coloured as a racial category meaning neither native nor white, turning South Africa's 2-century foundation in slavery into a trifling preface. The flats is not a beautiful part of the city. Its muted landscape, 200 square miles of sand with no focal point, no variation, also translates me to myself. I come to see my jarred brain as a featureless, overlooked place I had left. So I return. Returning there, the flatness, the taste of salt on the wind ballast me, pull me down from the weightlessness of the night. Something fell on my head. As a child, I ate the grey sand in the yard behind our house. Edged in by unpainted grey vibrocrete walls, the sand tasted like the colour it was. I remembered it, and I recognized it when I came back, the taste of the ground, the taste of the colour grey. I think of the wind and sea shaping a relief of the Cape, wearing it away, levelling its infinite grey sand, pummeling, pounding, grinding. The same words that make sand are the words for pain that make me, sandwoman, sand, the thing I'd been running away from, the thing I had become. Apartheid was short. We are brief, but sand is history. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Gabeba, thank you so much for that beautiful, beautiful, engaging presentation, your reading, your talk. I'm fascinated that you ended by saying sand is history, because that's what I am going to ask you about. And I'm so surprised that our words match so similarly, maybe because of the shared history that we have, and the cultural exchanges that we have over centuries between the two countries, India and South Africa. Memory plays a very big role, and this is a slightly long question. I hate long questions, but I'm going to ask you one,
Sure.
abusing my power of the moderator. So memory plays a very big role in your writing, and you enter many of the past spaces in your life in very exciting ways. One of the poems that stood out for me as a very representative one about this is The Mirror in Front of the Room, which is a poem about a mirror. It's an inanimate object, but it carries the scratches of history. It carries the imprints of history. You describe them in very beautiful ways. It reminds me of numerous poems in post-colonial literature, which is one of our favorite subjects in the English discipline, such as Small-Scale Reflections in a Great House by Ramanujan, A.K. Ramanujan, or Mina Alexander's House of a Thousand Doors, haunting poems. But also there are numerous novels written by post-colonial writers from formerly colonized nations about home. And obviously I was wondering that what is your relationship with home, belonging, which is a big theme in your work as well, but I would like to hear it in your words.
Thank you so much. I can listen to you forever, so long questions are no problem.
Thank you.
Home for me is a much longed for and desired concept. I try intensely to be in a home, to make a home, to feel at home. But I think as well, I inherited an unsettlement. Partly, most immediately, because I inherited my parents' experience of forced removal. But I think the legacy of slavery is precisely to make you not a thing, to make you a thing that does not belong, to make you unrooted, to make you unworthy, to make you not exist. So, Cape Town does not love the people who built it, the descendants of enslaved people. So I think there is a large atmosphere that seemed to make something as concrete as a home almost impossible. So hence my worrying at that concept, my returning over and over again, and also to try to find a home, whether it is in friendship, in love, in art, and in my body, finding a place inside my skull where there is some sense of rootedness and belonging, which will not be abruptly sheared off somehow. But I think that is something I'm always anticipating, and that is an inheritance, I think. And I think an inheritance for so many of us. I think nothing alerted me more to the politics of art than it is the people whom we despise, whose homes don't matter, so whose land we can take, who we never have to think about, who, are collateral damage in our larger, glorious path. So it is precisely the vulnerability that alerts me something here needs tending, needs tenderness as well.
And that is the legacy and the tool and of colonialism, right? That's home, to take away somebody's home. And I'm really fascinated the way you are also inserting yourself into this home by writing about sand. So that brings me to the next question, which is about sand, and something that you are so interested in. And when I think about sand, I think about sand on beaches, sand on rivers. I come from a state there are 50 rivers. But sand is also ephemeral. What we draw on sand will vanish the next hour or the next day. The sand castles is a symbol of ephemerality. Sand is always reminds me of Penelope's shroud, that it'll be, she will take it off while everybody goes to sleep. But at the same time, you are writing something, you're into it, and you are also creating art which is permanent. And so I just wanted to know what fascinates you about sand, and how differently you're looking at sand than the limited ways I'm looking at it. It's much more expansive.
For a long time I paid no attention to sand. If I, like many people, thought I had to leave the flats to become myself, to become an intellectual, to become an artist, I had to learn how to see it. My eyes were trained in exactly that conventional racist way. So I didn't ever pay attention to the sand except to be irritated by it. But I realized, my brother, who is a great artist himself, he's a tiler, he's also a gardener, he and my father have nourished the soil of this place they were all removed to across, say, by now 50, 60 years, into a little urban farm. So this sea sand, which literally kept no water, no worms, they had to slowly nourish it into a place that will now feed them. So I think about that relationship. That sand demanded that you didn't leave it, so that it could become something that nourished you. And so it is teaching me that all the time, but in a way, I got a crash course in it because of a concussion. I think my brother and my father did the long, long, long work. It is true, took the vegetable peels out of the compost bin, so I think I did play a role there, let us say, composting, growing soil, but I also left. And then the coming back to it, and so this is not a rational translation, but there was something so absolutely clear to me that this is how I could understand the me that came from this experience, but also the me that preceded it. So at last I had to pay attention to the sand.
I'm glad you did all the composting. It is part of your art creation in many ways, where you are contributing an uncultivable land to something that can produce life, arable land, right? So that's very beautiful, actually. So it's a very important contribution. We are getting questions in the audience, but I'm going to ask you about your current project, a quick question, because you have made a big formal shift in Autobiography of Sand, your current project at Radcliffe.
Yes.
And could you please throw some light on those choices? Because your earlier work is lyrical, they are shorter. This is also short, it has vignettes and it has short pieces of prose. I'm just curious about how has it been intellectually and artistically challenging and stimulating for you, this whole process?
As I mentioned, this earlier book, The History of Intimacy, took me a long time because I was also writing my academic book during the same time. And as I was writing The History of Intimacy in 2017, I was finishing it, I met with a very dear friend, Harry Garuba, who very sadly has passed away. I said, I feel I can't finish this because should I really be writing more lyric poetry? It's a third book, should I not be expanding my range? Is it just retreating to the same old, same old? And Harry, being the great wise soul that he was, said, Gabeba, write what you feel like writing, write what you are comfortable writing, write what you are good at writing. And so this enabled me to finish the book. And inside the book is an increasing turning to prose. And as I mentioned, this idea of revisiting what had previously been a lyric poem into an expanded form. And I think I'm always trying to find a form in which I can write about some immensity of Africa, because Africa is so filled with immensities, and yet we're reduced so often to trivial, shallow representations ourselves. So poetry was already a form I turned to, and now I think I'm turning to something else. And I have to say, I am extremely uncertain about my capacity in this larger expanded form. You and the other prose writers, I think I'm following slowly in your footsteps. But it felt to me so necessary to stretch beyond what I knew. And having done the book that Harry advised me to do, I think now, especially this experience of concussion, has asked for another form.
Yeah, but from little I know, I think you're doing an amazing job, and I can't wait to read the whole book. I'm going to go into the audience questions. There are many questions. I'm going to ask this question. Your work considers race, place, belonging, enslavement, and apartheid. These themes make me think of the role of race, place, land, and African ancestors in the American context. To what extent do your ancestors, beyond your parents, play a role in your work?
Thank you very much for recognizing me in this way. For a long time, I've lived in the US now for 21 years. I've often forgotten that I live in the US because I'm, so often really just attuned to the place that I had left. But overlooking that I am in the US means overlooking the ancestries of this land. And it overlooks the responsibilities, the answering that I have to this landscape also. So indeed, this is a landscape with its own deep history, its own geology, its own sandiness, to use that metaphor. And of course, because I am part of an African diaspora that is newer, it means I'm directly connected to an African diaspora that is previous to me. So in fact, even when I was in South Africa, Black Americans were, for us, a mode of liberation that spoke back to the destructive images that were always circulating. And Black South Africans came to the US to study. The first woman, Charlotte Makeke, who received a degree, studied here at Wilberforce University in Ohio. So, the AME Church, they are intense and powerful and deep relations between Africa and the US, of which I am finally recognizing myself to be a part. And as well, because I am also indigenous to South Africa, in addition to being part of a very, very mixed ancestry, I also am learning and reading about indigeneity and its relation to land here in the US. So to take seriously where I am, here also having roots, means to attend to those things too.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask this one last question. This is about your current project, so I'm very curious also. I'm struck by a line where you speak of the experience of being inside the concussion as distributed beyond my body. I'm struck by the stubbornness of sand, your imagination in this memoir, the pain, but also this distributedness as homing.
Lovely. Yes, I have been thinking about this question of distribution as form, distributed form, because what I'm often observing is that I'm leaking beyond myself. And I should be shoring up these boundaries that hold me. But what Sand is always saying is it's infinitely mobile, but it is not temporary. So one of the oldest markers of human development is a footprint in sand. So from hundreds of thousands of years ago. So sand, though it gives, it also holds. And it covers and it returns. So I think sand offers there a model for understanding distribution differently. Because that one sign of one footstep of a human ancestor of ours at the Cape from hundreds of thousands of years ago is there. And seeing that, just one impress of a foot on sand that can be kept for all of this time, I think it tells me something about being beyond yourself, right? And that, again, I am still learning this, how sand is teaching me about being, about existence.
Yeah, and that impression is art. Also, sand is also redistributed stones from the mountains by the river. So, yeah, I think we can go on and on speaking for the rest of the day, but it's already 1 o'clock. And I'm going to thank you everyone for coming here. Thank you, Gabeba, for your interesting presentation and perspectives. I also want to thank our audience for their terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.